The wire transfer request sat on Elena Grav's desk for 3 days before she opened it. Not because she didn't recognize the lawyer's firm. Not because she didn't understand what it meant when someone needed $500 million in immediate liquidity with offshore accounts preferred and no questions asked. She didn't open it because she knew, with the kind of certainty that lives in your bones, exactly who had sent it. Jonathan Hartwell. Her ex-husband, the man who had stood in a federal courtroom 15 years ago and calmly, methodically, thoroughly destroyed her life to save his own. The man who had testified that she, not him, never him, had orchestrated the trades that collapsed a fund worth $3.2 billion. The man who had looked at prosecutors and said her name like it was evidence. The man who had just been arrested for securities fraud. Elena stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her Montreal office, unmarked building, modest furnishings, 3 floors above a Vietnamese restaurant that made the stairwell smell like star anise and lemongrass, and watched snow settle onto Rue St. Paul like accusations. She was 51 now. Her hair had gone silver at the temples, a distinguished grey she'd stopped colouring 2 years ago. Her hands no longer shook when she signed documents. Her name no longer appeared on any of them. She had rebuilt everything he'd taken from her, brick by patient brick, entity by invisible entity, offshore structure by bulletproof offshore structure, and she'd done it so quietly, so carefully, that no one in finance knew she was back. That was the point. The request sat on her desk like a lit fuse. She let it sit one more day, let him wonder, let him sweat. Then she picked up her phone and dialed the attorney's number from memory. "Tell him yes," Elena said. The woman on the other end, Margaret Chen, one of the best criminal defense attorneys in New York, which meant Jonathan was serious, which meant Jonathan was desperate, paused. "Ms. Grave, given your history with Mr. Hartwell, I have to ask if you're certain." "I have 2 conditions," Elena continued, her voice as level as a surgical blade. "He works for me, publicly, as my employee, for 2 years, and he does exactly what I say when I say it, with no questions, no negotiations, and no exit clause." Silence on the other end of the line. "Ms. Chen, are you still there?" "He'll never agree to that." "He will," Elena said, "because he's out of options. Because every other person with the kind of capital and infrastructure he needs will ask questions he can't answer, and because he knows I'm the only person on earth capable of making his current problem disappear." "What makes you so certain?" Elena smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Because I built half of what he thinks he built. Tell him to be in Montreal tomorrow. My office. 9 a.m. If he's late, the offer expires. If he brings anyone with him, the offer expires. If he tries to negotiate, the offer expires." She hung up before Margaret could respond. Outside her window, the snow kept falling. Quiet, relentless, beautiful. Elena opened her desk drawer, the bottom one, the one that required a key she wore on a chain she never took off, and pulled out a photograph. Jonathan at 39, her at 36. Their house in Connecticut, the one with the wraparound porch and the garden she'd planted herself. His arm around her waist, her hand resting on his chest, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Some joke, some moment of shared joy that felt, at the time, like it would last forever. The photo had been taken 3 weeks before the indictment. 4 weeks before he testified. 6 weeks before she lost everything. She studied his face in the photograph, tried to reconcile that man, open, boyish hers, with the one who had looked at federal prosecutors and said, "Elena Grave was the architect. I was following her instructions." She couldn't. She put the photograph back, locked the drawer, poured herself 2 fingers of whiskey even though it was barely noon. The flight from New York to Montreal was 90 minutes. He'd be booking it right now, packing a bag, trying to figure out what she wanted. Let him wonder. She had 15 years of wondering to repay. "If you're still here, stay a little longer. I need to know, do you think someone can love the same person twice? After betrayal, after years, after everything breaks? Let me know in the comments, because what's coming next? It's going to test that question in ways neither of them expected. Jonathan Hartwell had always looked good in handcuffs. That was Alina's first thought when she saw the footage on Bloomberg. Her ex-husband, 54 years old and still devastatingly composed, being led out of his Tribeca office by federal agents. His Hermes tie was loosened. His expression was blank in that practiced way of men who have spent decades controlling every micro-expression. He didn't look at the cameras. She watched the clip 4 times. Noted the way his jaw tightened when the agent's hand pressed down on his head, getting him into the black SUV. Noted the absence of his wife, third wife, Alina had heard through the grapevine, some Danish architect 20 years his junior who'd lasted 18 months before filing for divorce. She felt nothing. Or she felt everything compressed into something so dense it looked like nothing. Her assistant knocked. "Ms. Chen is here." Margaret Chen walked into Alina's office like she owned it, which Alina supposed was what you paid $1,500 an hour for. She was mid-50s, sharp as a scalpel, dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He agreed, Margaret said without preamble, sitting in the chair across from Alina's desk without being invited, to every single term. Alina leaned back. Does he understand what he's agreeing to? He understands that in 6 months, every federal prosecutor between here and Singapore will have a file on him thick enough to bury him for 20 years. He understands that his legal fees will bankrupt him before discovery is even complete. And he understands that you're the only person with the liquidity, the offshore networks, and the expertise to make this disappear without a trace. What does he think I want? Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. He thinks you want to humiliate him. Publicly, systematically, he thinks you want revenge. And what do you think, Ms. Chen? I think, Margaret said carefully, that people who want revenge don't wait 15 years to take it. I think you want something else entirely, and I think he's about to find out what. Alina smiled. Tell him to be here tomorrow. 9 a.m. not 9:01. If he's late, the offer expires and he can enjoy his federal prosecution. Alina, may I call you Alina? No. Ms. Grave, then, the charges against him. You should know that they're going to implicate you too. Eventually, the transactions they're tracing, at least half of them root through entities you were involved with back in 2008. If this goes to trial. It won't go to trial. How can you be certain? Because I'm going to make it go away, Alina said. That's what he's paying me for, isn't it? Margaret stood, paused at the door. For what it's worth, and I know it's worth nothing, he's been trying to find you for years. He hired 3 different investigative firms, sent letters to every address that might have been yours. You vanished completely. I know. You knew he was looking. Of course I knew, Alina said. I made sure he couldn't find me. Now is there anything else, Ms. Chen? I have work to do. When she was alone, Alina opened that drawer again, took out the photograph, stared at it until the faces blurred. She had loved him so completely, it had felt like a religion. She had trusted him so entirely she'd signed documents without reading them, given him access to accounts he shouldn't have had, believed him when he said they were building something together. And when everything collapsed, when the trades went bad and the fund imploded, and the federal government came looking for someone to crucify, he had chosen himself. She put the photograph back, locked the drawer, poured another finger of whiskey. Tomorrow Jonathan Hartwell would walk into her office. He would sit across from her. He would agree to be diminished, humiliated, reduced. And she would smile. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Whose side are you on right now? The woman who lost everything and wants her revenge? Or the man who's about to walk into a trap he might deserve? Comment below. Tell me who you're rooting for, because I promise, by the end of this, your answer might change. He was 8 minutes early. Elena watched from the third-floor window as a black town car pulled up to the curb. Watched Jonathan get out, look up at the unmarked building, and hesitate. He wore a charcoal wool overcoat. No suit jacket underneath, just a black sweater. His hair was shorter than she remembered, grey at the temples, silver through the rest. He looked tired in a way that money couldn't fix. Good. When he walked into her office, escorted by her assistant, who looked at him like he was a bomb that might detonate, Elena didn't stand. Jonathan. His voice hadn't changed. Low, controlled, careful in that way that made you wonder what he was controlling. Elena. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Sit. He did. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. His gaze moved over the office, taking in the minimal furniture, the single abstract painting, the complete absence of personal objects. No photographs, no degrees on the wall, no softness anywhere. This is what you built, he said finally. This is where I work. What I built, you'll never see. His jaw tightened. I didn't know you were back in finance. That was the idea. Silence stretched between them like a chasm. Elena let it. She'd learned in 15 years of rebuilding in the shadows that silence was a weapon. Most people rushed to fill it, gave away their position, revealed their weakness. Jonathan had always known how to wait. But she could wait longer. Finally, he leaned forward slightly. I assume you've read the charges. I have. Then you know they're bullshit. Are they? You know they are. Elena picked up a pen, rolled it between her fingers. What I know is that you're facing federal securities fraud charges, that the evidence appears substantial, that your assets have been frozen pending trial, and that you need $500 million in clean money to make this go away before it destroys what's left of your reputation. It's a setup, Elena. Isn't it always? He flinched, just slightly, just enough for her to see. She set the pen down, leaned back. Here's how this works. I have the liquidity you need. I have the offshore networks to move money through jurisdictions that won't cooperate with US prosecutors. I have the shell corporations, the nominee directors, the layers of protection. I can make this disappear. What do you want? I told Margaret, you work for me. You do what I say for 2 years. I know what you told her. I'm asking what you actually want. Elena stood, walked to the window. When she spoke, her voice was quieter but no less sharp. I want people to see you walking into my building every morning at 8. I want the Wall Street Journal to photograph you carrying my coffee. I want Bloomberg to speculate about what leverage I have over you. I want every board you sat on, every fund that courted you, every investor who thought you were untouchable. I want them to know that you answer to me now. You want to destroy my reputation. She turned to face him. Your reputation destroyed itself when you got arrested for fraud, Jonathan. I'm offering you a way to survive. Whether you come out of this with any dignity is entirely up to you. He stood too, slowly, and after 2 years. After 2 years, the charges will be gone. Your assets will be clean. You'll be free to rebuild. And you'll never hear from me again. Why? Does it matter? Yes. Elena held his gaze. 15 years ago, she would have looked away, would have softened, would have believed whatever story he told her next. It's not anymore. Because in 2008, she said, her voice steady, you stood in a federal courtroom and testified that I orchestrated trades I had nothing to do with. You said I manipulated accounts you managed. You let them believe I was the criminal mastermind while you were just following orders. And when they took everything from me, my career, my savings, my name, my ability to work anywhere in the world, you walked away with a fine and a consulting ban you ignored within 2 years. She stepped closer. So yes, Jonathan, I want people to see you diminished. I want them to wonder what I know, what I have on you, what power I must have to make a man like you, a man who once had everything, work for me like a junior analyst. I want you to understand what it feels like to be powerless. I didn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. You chose yourself. Elena, Do you accept my terms, or do I tell Margaret to find you someone else? Though I should mention, I already spoke to the 3 other people with the capacity to help you. They're not interested. He stared at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Calculation, realization, maybe the first flicker of understanding that he'd underestimated her completely. I accept. Good, you start Monday. 8 a.m. My assistant will send you the address. Don't be late. Can I ask you one thing before I leave? Maybe. Did you ever forgive me? Alina walked back to her desk, sat down, picked up her pen again. No, she said without looking up, I didn't. Jonathan started the following Monday. Alina had an office prepared for him on the 2nd floor. Small, no windows, a desk that had been salvaged from a bankruptcy auction, a laptop with restricted access, a phone with a single line. His first assignment, review compliance documentation for a fund Alina was quietly acquiring in Bratislava. Tedious work, the kind that junior analysts did, the kind that required no expertise and generated no value except demonstrating that you were willing to do what you were told. He didn't complain. Every morning at 8 he arrived, walked past the Vietnamese restaurant, climbed 3 flights of stairs, nodded to Alina's assistant, and disappeared into his windowless office. Every evening at 6 he left. He wore the same rotation of 4 suits. He didn't speak to anyone unless spoken to. When people asked Alina's assistant who the new person was, she said, a consultant. The Wall Street Journal ran a photograph in week 2. Jonathan Hartwell, once worth north of $400 million, walking into an unmarked building in Montreal carrying 2 paper coffee cups. The headline, Fallen Titan, where is Jonathan Hartwell now? Alina had the article framed, hung it in the conference room where she met with investors. Jonathan saw it during a compliance meeting, said nothing. At night, alone in her apartment overlooking the St. Lawrence River, Alina read the files he'd brought with him. Transaction records, emails, offshore account structures, forensic trails that connected dots most people didn't even know existed. Everything he'd kept from 2008. She'd suspected for years, but seeing it confirmed was different. Jonathan hadn't been the mastermind. He'd been the fall guy. Someone bigger, someone with more power, more reach, more to lose, had structured the trades that collapsed the fund, had used Jonathan's credentials, his access, his name, and when it all came apart, they'd made him a deal. Testify against Alina, redirect the investigation, or go to prison for 30 years. He'd chosen Alina. But what the records also showed, what she hadn't known, what she'd spent 15 years not knowing, was that he'd tried to protect her first. He'd offered to take full responsibility, to plead guilty to everything, to go to prison if it meant she stayed clear. They'd refused. They wanted someone prominent, someone whose prosecution would send a message, someone the media could turn into a symbol of Wall Street greed. Alina Grave, the young rising star, the woman who'd made partner at 32, who'd been profiled in Fortune and Forbes and Financial Times. Perfect. So Jonathan had given them what they wanted. And he'd spent the next 15 years carrying it. Alina closed the file, poured herself 2 fingers of whiskey, a habit she'd picked up after Connecticut, after the trial, after she'd left the country with $3,000 and a fake passport. She stood at her window and watched the river and hated, absolutely hated, that she understood. They didn't speak beyond work for 6 weeks. Professional emails, terse instructions, compliance reviews and account reconciliations, and the kind of tedious financial work that kept the offshore networks running but required no real interaction. Then one Thursday night in late November, Alina stayed late. She was reviewing acquisition contracts in her office, 3rd floor, windows facing the river, the only space in the building with any warmth, when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, coat on, briefcase in hand. He looked surprised to see her. "You're still here," he said. "So are you." "I was just leaving." He hesitated. "Do you ever eat dinner, or do you just survive on spite and whiskey?" Despite herself, despite everything, Alina almost smiled. Spite is surprisingly nutritious. "There's a bistro 2 blocks east. They close at 10. I'm going there now." He paused. "You could come if you wanted." "Jonathan." "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Alina. I'm not asking to explain. I'm asking if you want food." She should have said no, should have reminded him that this arrangement was professional. Transactional, finite, that he was her employee, not her friend, and certainly not anything more. But she was tired. And it had been 15 years since she'd had a real conversation with someone who remembered who she was before everything burned. "1 hour," she said. The bistro was nearly empty. Exposed brick, mismatched chairs, candles on every table. They sat in the back corner, ordered without looking at menus. He still remembered what she liked, apparently, which shouldn't have meant anything but somehow did. When the food came, neither of them touched it immediately. "I read your files," Alina said. Jonathan's expression didn't change, and "You were set up. Whoever structured those trades used your access but left you exposed. When it collapsed, they needed someone to blame. They chose you." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me? Back then, before the testimony, why didn't you explain?" "Would you have believed me?" "I don't know, but you didn't try." He leaned back in his chair, looked older in the candlelight, worn in ways that had nothing to do with age. "They gave me 48 hours. They had recordings of me authorizing trades I barely remembered authorizing. They had emails I'd sent at 2 in the morning, half drunk after client dinners that read like intent. And they told me if I didn't cooperate, they'd prosecute both of us. You'd lose everything. I'd lose everything. But if I testified against you, they'd go easy. Probation for you. Fines, maybe house arrest. You'd survive." "That's not what happened." "I know," his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I gave them enough, made the case strong enough, they'd be satisfied. They'd leave you alone. Instead," he stopped, started again. "Instead, they crucified us both. You just got the worse cross." Alina picked up her wine glass, put it down without drinking. "You testified that I was in charge, that I directed the trades, that I was the mastermind." "I know what I said." "Do you know what it did to me?" Her voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. "I wasn't just broke, Jonathan. I was unemployable, blacklisted, untouchable. People I'd worked with for 15 years wouldn't return my calls. I couldn't get a job at a community bank in Nebraska. I had to leave the country under false name just to find work. I had to rebuild from absolutely nothing while you," she stopped, controlled herself. "While you consulted for hedge funds and spoke at conferences and lived in Tribeca." "I didn't walk away, Alina. I just kept standing when you couldn't see me anymore." "What does that mean?" He met her eyes, held her gaze. "It means I spent the last 15 years making sure you could come back. Every fund I consulted for, every entity I helped structure, every offshore network I built them knowing that one day you'd need them. I left doors open. I created infrastructure. I made sure that if you ever decided to return to finance, you'd have everything you needed." Alina stared at him. "You're saying you built this for me?" "I'm saying I never stopped trying to fix what I broke." She couldn't find words. "That's insane." "Probably," he finally picked up his fork, "but it's true." They ate in silence. Alina's mind was racing, reshuffling 15 years of assumptions. If what he was saying was real, if he'd spent a decade and a half building the networks and structures she'd been using to rebuild, then everything she'd accomplished wasn't just hers. It was theirs. A foundation laid in penance. "The charges you're facing now," she said carefully, "the securities fraud, they're not real, are they?" Jonathan smiled. It was a sad, exhausted smile. "No." You got yourself arrested on purpose. I needed you to come back, publicly. I needed people to see that you'd survived, that you were powerful enough to make a man's federal charges disappear. He set his fork down. And I needed you to know the truth about 2008. I couldn't just tell you, you'd never have believed me. But if you read the files yourself, saw the evidence. You manipulative son of a bitch. Yes. Alina's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table. You staged your own arrest. You destroyed your reputation. You designed this entire scenario to force me out of hiding and make me read files that would change how I saw the past. I prefer to think of it as an elaborate apology. Jonathan, I know what you lost, he said, and now his voice was raw, stripped of every careful control. I know what I cost you. I know I can't give you back those 15 years. Can't undo the testimony or the trial or the years you spent invisible. He paused, but I could give you this, a stage, a comeback, proof that you didn't just survive, you're untouchable now, more powerful than you ever were before. She couldn't breathe. Why? Because I never stopped loving you, and because you deserved better than what I gave you the first time. Pause just for a second. What are you feeling right now? Anger, doubt, something else you can't name? Drop one word in the comments, just one. The first thing that comes to mind when you think about what he just said. I want to know what this moment does to you. Alina didn't go back to the office that night. She walked through Montreal's empty streets, past closed boutiques and shuttered cafes, through neighborhoods where snow gathered in the angles of buildings like evidence. She walked until her feet ached, and her breath came out in clouds, and she couldn't feel her fingers inside her leather gloves. Trying to process what Jonathan had just told her. It was too much, too calculated, too exactly what she would have done. That was the worst part. She understood the logic, the patience, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a single, precise outcome. She would have done the same thing. She hated that she understood. When she finally made it home, a converted loft in old Montreal, exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture she'd chosen because it was beautiful and impersonal, she poured another whiskey and pulled out the photograph again. Them laughing before the collapse. She'd spent 15 years believing he'd betrayed her for survival, for money, for cowardice. If he'd done it to protect her, if he'd spent every year since trying to build her a way back, then what did that make her anger, her revenge, her carefully constructed plan to humiliate him? Her phone buzzed, a text from Jonathan. I know you need time, take it, I'll be at the office tomorrow, and the day after, for as long as you need me. She stared at the message, typed and deleted 3 different responses, finally sent. We need to talk about 2008, all of it, everything you know, no more games. His reply came within seconds. Anything you want to know, I'm done hiding. They met the next morning, not at the office, at Alina's apartment. Neutral ground, though she suspected there was no such thing as neutral ground when you were excavating 15 years of wreckage. Jonathan arrived at 8, brought coffee, her order exactly right, which meant he still remembered, and a leather portfolio stuffed with documents. After you left the country, he said, sitting at her kitchen table, I hired investigators. Not to find you, I knew better than to track you down without permission, but to find out who set us up, who actually structured the trades that buried us both. He opened the portfolio. Inside were photographs, bank records, email chains, forensic accounting reports. His name is Victor Landry. He was senior partner at the fund we worked for. He used our credentials, mine and yours, to run a parallel trading scheme. High-risk derivatives, over-leveraged positions, all of it hidden in accounts that looked legitimate. When it collapsed, he made it look like we were responsible. Alina studied the documents, corporate structures, shell companies, offshore accounts in jurisdictions that didn't cooperate with US regulators. Why wasn't he prosecuted? Because he cut a deal, gave the prosecutors us. In exchange, they agreed not to investigate his offshore accounts or his role in the trades. And you found this when? 3 years after you disappeared. Jonathan, Elena's voice was dangerous now, controlled rage wrapped in silk. You've known for 12 years that we were both innocent, that we were framed, and you never. I tried to tell you, he interrupted. I sent letters to every address I could find. I hired investigators to track you down, but you disappeared completely. New name, new identity, new life, nothing traceable. I couldn't reach you. So you just waited. What else could I do? He spread his hands. I couldn't clear your name without you, couldn't go public with evidence that implicated you without your permission, and I couldn't find you. So I did the only thing I could. I built you an empire in the shadows, created structures you could use if you ever came back, made sure that when you were ready, you'd have everything you needed to be untouchable. Elena sank into the chair across from him. Outside, morning light reflected off the St. Lawrence River in cold, bright shards. This is insane, she said. It's love, Elena. Insane love, maybe, but love. She looked at him, really looked. Saw the grey in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the bone-deep exhaustion that wealth and power couldn't touch. What happened to your marriages? She asked. The ones after me. I sabotaged them, all 3 of them. Why? Because they weren't you. Here's what I need to know. Is this forgiveness? Manipulation? Both. Hit the like button if you think she should forgive him. Skip it if you think she should walk away. Because what happens next, it depends on what she believes. They went after Victor Landry together. It took 4 months of meticulous surgical work. Elena used her offshore networks to trace his hidden accounts, entities in the Caymans, the British Virgin Islands, Luxembourg, Singapore. Jonathan used his remaining Wall Street connections to gather testimony from people who'd worked with Landry, who'd seen things but been too afraid to speak. Margaret Chen orchestrated the legal strategy, built a case so airtight, so thoroughly documented, that there would be no room for deals or plea bargains or quiet settlements. And when they finally had everything, when the evidence was comprehensive and undeniable, they didn't go to prosecutors. They went to the press. The New York Times ran the story on a Sunday. Front page above the fold, Wall Street's ghost, how one man framed 2 colleagues and walked free for 15 years. Within 72 hours, federal investigators reopened the 2008 case. Within 2 weeks, Victor Landry was arrested at his estate in Greenwich. Within a month, Elena Grave and Jonathan Hartwell were formally, publicly, completely exonerated. The financial press went wild. Bloomberg called it the most dramatic reversal in modern finance. The Wall Street Journal profiled Elena as the woman who'd rebuilt an empire in secret. Forbes estimated her current net worth at $1.2 billion. Elena held a single press conference. She wore black, stood at a podium in a Montreal hotel with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, spoke for exactly 3 minutes. 15 years ago, I lost my career, my reputation, and my life because of a lie, she said, her voice steady and clear. I rebuilt in silence. I didn't do it for vindication. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because I refused to disappear. Today, the truth is public. That's all I have to say. She walked off the stage before they could ask questions. Jonathan didn't hold a press conference. He issued a single statement through Margaret. I was wrong to stay silent. I will spend the rest of my life making it right. The night after the exoneration, they met at the same bistro. Same table in the back, same candles, same comfortable silence while they waited for food that neither of them was particularly hungry for. So, Jonathan said finally, what now? Elena sipped her wine. Now I have 3 acquisitions closing next quarter. A fund in Singapore that needs restructuring, and a compliance issue in Dublin that requires my attention. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. Elena. Jonathan, she set down her glass, looked at him directly. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I even want to. You made choices that destroyed me. You let me believe for 15 years that you betrayed me for selfish reasons. That's not something I can just. I understand. But, she paused, let the word hang there. I understand why you did it. I understand that you were put in an impossible position. And I understand that you've spent 15 years trying to fix it. That has to count for something. Does it count for dinner once a week? No expectations. Just dinner. Just dinner until you decide what you want, if you decide you want anything at all. Elena studied him across the table, saw the man she'd loved at 36, saw the man who'd destroyed her at 37, saw the man who'd spent 15 years building her a kingdom in secret because he didn't know how else to apologize. Once a week, she said, Wednesdays here. Wednesdays, he agreed. They finished their meal in the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who have survived something terrible together. When they left, Jonathan offered his arm. Elena hesitated. Then took it. Outside, snow was beginning to fall. 6 months later, Elena's company went public. The IPO raised $2.3 billion. She owned controlling interest. The financial press called it the most remarkable comeback in modern Wall Street history. Forbes put her on the cover with the headline, "The Woman Who Came Back from Nothing." Jonathan was at the opening bell. Not on the trading floor, he stood in the back of the observation deck, watching as Elena rang the bell and smiled for cameras, and became, officially, one of the most powerful women in finance. Afterward, at the celebratory dinner Elena's team had organized at a restaurant in Tribeca, Jonathan found her on the terrace, alone, looking out at the city lights. You should be inside, she said without turning around, celebrating. I'm not the one who built this. You built half of it, the infrastructure, the offshore networks, I built it for you, he interrupted gently. That's different. Elena turned to face him. She wore a navy dress, simple and elegant, diamond earrings, new ones bought with money she'd earned herself. Her hair was pulled back, her expression unreadable. Jonathan, she said, I need to ask you something. Anything. Have you decided what you want, after the 2 years are up, after you fulfilled the terms of our arrangement? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I've known what I want since the day I walked into your Montreal office. The question is whether you've decided. Decided what? If you're going to forgive me, if Wednesday dinners are as far as this goes, or if there's something else, something more. Elena stepped closer, close enough to see the silver in his eyes, the vulnerable set of his mouth, the way he was holding himself perfectly still, as if afraid one wrong move would shatter whatever was building between them. I don't know if I'll ever completely forgive you, she said. There are parts of the last 15 years that still hurt when I think about them. Nights I spent alone in foreign cities, rebuilding from nothing. Moments when I wanted to call you and couldn't. Times when I hated you so completely I couldn't breathe. I know. But, she paused. I also know I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what we could have been if we'd had the courage to try again, if we'd been willing to look at the wreckage and decide it was worth rebuilding. Is that a yes? That's a maybe, a very expensive, very complicated, very uncertain maybe. Jonathan smiled, the first real, unguarded smile she'd seen from him in 15 years. I'll take it. Elena kissed him. Soft, careful, like something fragile they were learning to hold without breaking. When they pulled apart, she said, If you ever lie to me again. I won't. If you ever choose yourself over us. I won't. If you ever. Elena, he cupped her face in his hands. I spent 15 years in the dark, 15 years carrying what I did to you. I'm not going back. Whatever this becomes, whatever we build, I'm all in, completely. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. Maybe that was enough. If you're still with me, if this story has gotten under your skin, subscribe, because I tell stories like this. Stories about people who destroyed each other and found a way back. Stories that don't give you easy answers. Stories that stay with you long after they end. Hit subscribe, you won't regret it. 2 years after the exoneration, Alina and Jonathan got married. Small ceremony, no press, no public announcement, just Margaret Chen as witness and a judge in Montreal who asked no questions and signed the license without commentary. They honeymooned in Nova Scotia, rented a house on the coast, weathered wood, floor-to-ceiling windows, the Atlantic crashing against rocks 50 yards from the back deck, spent 2 weeks doing nothing but reading and cooking, and remembering how to be two people who chose each other instead of two people bound by guilt and history. On the last night, sitting on the deck with wine and blankets and the sound of waves like breathing, Jonathan said, "Do you ever regret it, letting me back in?" Alina thought about it, really thought, considered the 15 years of anger, the months of uncertainty. The risk of trusting someone who'd destroyed her once already. "No," she said finally, "I regret that we lost 15 years. I regret that it took a public exoneration and a staged arrest for me to believe you. I regret that we had to excavate so much pain to get here, but I don't regret this." Good. They sat in silence, watched the ocean darken as the sun dropped below the horizon, felt the weight of everything they'd survived pressing them together instead of pulling them apart. "Jonathan," Alina said eventually, "if you ever write a memoir about any of this, I'm divorcing you immediately." He laughed, actually laughed, the sound carried away by wind. Noted. "I'm serious." "I know you are," he kissed her temple. "No memoir, no tell-all, no interviews, just us." "Just us," she agreed. And for the first time in 15 years, she meant it without reservation. 3 years into their marriage, Alina sold her company for $6.8 billion. She retained a minority stake and stayed on the board, but operational control went to the executive team she'd spent years building. People she trusted, people who understood that wealth meant nothing if you destroyed yourself acquiring it. Jonathan had walked away from finance entirely, spent his time on a project he'd mentioned only once, casually, over dinner, building structures that helped people who'd been wrongly convicted clear their names, funding investigators, paying legal fees, creating the kind of infrastructure he'd wished existed when he and Alina had needed it. They split their time between Montreal and a farmhouse they'd bought in upstate New York. Quiet land, privacy, space to breathe. One evening, sitting in the Montreal apartment where this had all begun, Alina found herself thinking about the wire transfer request, the one that had sat on her desk for 3 days, the one that had started everything. Jonathan walked in from the kitchen with 2 glasses of wine. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The beginning," Alina said, "when you needed $500 million and I made you work for me for 2 years. Best decision I ever made. Agreeing to my terms." "No," he sat beside her, "trusting that you'd eventually see what I'd been trying to tell you for 15 years. Alina leaned against him, and what was that? "That I never stopped being yours, even when you didn't want me, even when I didn't deserve it." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, I have a confession." "Tell me." "I knew you were going to say yes. The moment Margaret called with the transfer request, I knew you'd agree to any terms I set, not because you were desperate, but because you'd been waiting for me to ask." Jonathan smiled. "How long have you known?" "Since the bistro, when you told me you'd built it all for me." She turned to look at him. "I spent 15 years thinking you'd betrayed me for selfish reasons, and you spent 15 years building me a way back because you didn't know how else to apologize. We're both terrible at this." "At what?" "Trusting each other, saying what we mean, not carrying everything alone." "Then let's get better at it," Jonathan said. "We have time now." And they did. All the time in the world. The wire transfer request sat on Alina Grav's desk for 3 days before she opened it. But that was a lifetime ago. Now she sits in a house that overlooks the St. Lawrence River with a man who destroyed her and spent the rest of his life rebuilding her, and she thinks, maybe love isn't about being undamaged. Maybe it's about finding someone willing to sift through the wreckage with you. Maybe it's about second chances that cost everything and are worth it anyway. Maybe forgiveness isn't a single moment, but 1,000 small decisions to keep choosing the same person. She doesn't have all the answers, but she's willing to spend the rest of her life finding out. Leave me one word, the first thing you felt when this ended, the emotion sitting in your chest right now. I'll be here, reading every single one. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own, you know where to find more.